Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Rishabh Thakur, a contributing editor for Borderlines, an online platform run by graduate students that aims to rethink the academic practice of region and area studies by questioning theoretical and disciplinary approaches towards these academic formations. Today, we are very excited to hold a virtual space for a conversation between Elizabeth Povinelli and Amit Baishya on topics spanning the Anthropocene, ordinary modes of endurance, and late liberalism. Before we begin proper, let me introduce these two scholars. Elizabeth Povinelli is the Franz Boas Professor of Anthropology and Gender Studies in Columbia University in the city of New York. Her research has focused on developing a critical theory of late settler liberalism that would support an anthropology of the otherwise. This thinking has unfolded across several books, numerous essays, and a 35-year-long collaboration with her Indigenous colleagues in North Australia, including most recently 6 films they have created as members of the Karabing Film Collective. Amit Baishya is an associate professor in the Department of English at the University of Oklahoma. He writes about political terror, survival, and the Anthropocene, drawing on film and literature from South Asia. He also translates short stories and novels from Assamese to English, and his translation of Debendranath Acharya's Jangam on the forgotten long march of Indians from Burma during the World War II was released in 2018. As such, both Professors Povinelli and Baishya not only transgress disciplinary boundaries and engage seamlessly across anthropology, comparative literature, critical theory, and philosophy in their academic endeavors, but they also work with filmmaking and literary translation in their broad intellectual engagements with the worlds that they care about. Today, Professor Baishya will be posing questions to Elizabeth Povinelli, whose works have influenced his own writing, to draw out and think through some of these themes of mutual interest. Let us begin then without further ado. The floor is all yours, Professor Baishya.
Thank you very much, Rishabh. Thanks for inviting me, and thanks, of course, to Borderlines for facilitating this. And good to see you, Beth, after so many years. and just as Rishabh mentioned, your work has, of course, helped me a lot in terms of thinking about questions of endurance and survival in political terror, and also in my recent work on the Anthropocene. So I'll begin, first of all, by asking you the sort of broad question, right? And then we'll go into more specific ones dealing with your with each of your published works. So the broad question would be, like, at the beginning and the end of Geontologies, you talk about how this book allows you to take stock of your writing as a whole, right? I mean, in some sense, it allows you to look back, that there are certain themes that have intensified over the 5 published books that you have you've written, sorry. So my question would be, is that can we take both a forward-looking direction in terms of your work about how certain themes have developed over time? For instance, in Labor's Lot, you talk about sweat, right? And the sweat, in some sense, tying people to place, so to speak, in some ways. And then this comes back again, for instance, in Economies of Abandonment, in Geontologies, as you start thinking more about questions about the Anthropocene, about endurance, about survival, but also to take a look sort of back in some ways. How, you talk about how, for instance, Geontologies is a sort of a rewriting of Labor's Lot, but in a very different way. So maybe taking both the look forward and backward in that sense.
Yeah. I often say that I'm writing one book, but it just has very long chapters. Mm-hmm. And so each book takes up a problem that the last one ended with, or I think ended with, like the problem that, because I usually drive into a wreck and say, this is the wreck we're in, right? And it takes me a little while to figure out, okay, out of that wreck, what is the next movement? And the second very broad way of thinking about the 5 books, 6 books, is that all of them, although you know, I write them, they're definitely come out of this particular mind body thing. They come out of an ever longer conversation with an older generation from Belleune, which is a small indigenous community in the north, and then of course with my Cottabing colleagues. And the Cottabing come from Belleune, so we have really literally grown up together. So since we've been doing things since I was 20, since 1984. So my thought is always thinking with them, alongside them, and more importantly, my thought was really initialized, I guess that's the way to say it, by the generation above me there, so the older men and women, who kind of literally recruited me into my position. And they recruited me into my position, and this has to do with labor thought. They recruited me into the position of an anthropologist because of the position they were in as indigenous subjects within a settler colonial state. And it very specifically, they were laboring under a law, the Land Rights Act, that was passed in 1976, that the settler state considered, you know, a landmark act that recognized that indigenous people owned their land, and so set up mechanisms by which what they called the state called traditional Aboriginal owners could make a claim, and the language is so screwed up, make a claim to the state for the return of what was already theirs. So it's just, you know, it's a usual circle. We'll come back to that. When I first went to Australia in '84, I was a philosopher, but under this Land Rights Act, Indigenous subjects in Australia have to have all their claims mediated by an anthropologist and a lawyer. So it was that older generation that said, you know, why don't you come back and be our lawyer? They were involved in the claim. And I didn't want to be a lawyer. I've never wanted to be a lawyer. And so they said anthropologist. So, and it's a bit of a long story, but I'm trying to like suggest how deeply my thought it has been initialized, and deeply my life has been initialized by this long conversation with folks at Belleune. There was also this it was a pretty funny conversation, because people were very savage and funny, still are. And when I said I didn't know what an anthropologist was, when in '85 really, they asked me to come back and do it for them. And they said, it's white people studying us. I was like, oh, I couldn't believe it. I was like, seriously? They said, yes, they study our culture. I was like, oh, wow, that's wild. What's that? So, because I was in philosophy, I didn't know what that was. And I said, that's what you want me to do? And they said, no, we want you to help us understand what this, they didn't use the word mechanism, but they said, what pedagogy, or which means white or settler, what they're doing, what is this? And I would say, what is this apparatus of recognition that's descending on us? Let's try and understand this together. We'll help you, you help us. So it's a deep, my work is not studying them, it's studying alongside everybody, with each other. What are the mechanisms, what's the shape of late liberalism and late settler liberalism if you're standing alongside my colleagues and staring at it from their lives? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So yeah, so a lot of the concepts that have been developed from labor's lot through to the present come out of that conversation, and certainly a broader understanding of the sensory interdependencies and semiotics of the human and more than human world is one of them. So sweat and other.
Let me just pick up on something that you said. You said that, you know, when you first met your colleagues in Australia, in Billion, you said that you didn't know what an anthropologist was, and they said that it's white people studying us, right? But, and then,
So spot on, right?
which is, you know, correct to a large extent, I think. But, you know, but the thing that you mentioned, of course, in geontology at the beginning is that it was never about explaining them to others, but it was really looking, my object of study really is late liberalism.
That's right.
When you look at it from their perspective, right?
That's right.
So I'd like to ask you a little bit about this object of study, late liberalism. What exactly do you understand? I mean, how can we understand late liberalism? Of course, you make these distinctions at the beginning of Economies of Abandonment, but for our larger audience here today, what exactly is this object called late liberalism, and why not use a term like neoliberalism, let's say?
Yeah. No, it's a great question. And again, I can kind of do how these books set the stage for rethinking things one after the other. So I go over in 84 and 85. Well, by 84 and 85 in Australia, but also in the broader Anglo diaspora, let's say, the Anglo-colonial world, the Americas, there had been a shift from, and especially in Australia, since the late 70s, a shift from an explicit white nationalism and a explicit xenophobia relative to Asia, to what they call multiculturalism. That is a liberal form of the recognition of the worth of difference. Right. So, and again, I was like really a classical, like I went to St. John's in Santa Fe, where there was tension between Native Americans, the history of Latinx and Hispanic, and then American white colonialism. But so I go there, and and I'm fully a subject of that emergence in some ways of this liberal form of recognition. But I'm just like, what is going on here, right? I'm more in like, what is this? And we're working to try and think through the apparatus of a Land Rights Act that was shaped within the politics of recognition. So that was what I was doing first. And then I started thinking, wait, what is this? Like, what? And the cunning of recognition starts trying to think about liberalism as in its different periodizations and geographical dispersions. So I start thinking, okay, first labor's law is like, what is the settler state demanding people, indigenous people, be in order for them to see them as indigenous? The cunning of recognition expands it out a bit, because the first one is more about value and expands out to a national perspective. And I start thinking with everybody, what are they recognizing? What is this? And in the process of trying to understand the mechanisms by which recognition is a strategy by which liberalism re-entrenches its authority rather than gives it up. So this is 2002, I'm thinking about this in kind of. Then I just start thinking, wait a minute, how is this part of a bigger global periodization of liberalism? And how would I understand that, how Australia fits in that bigger global picture? And that's where I start. And I can say why late liberalism as a phrase, but we can put that aside. But by, I would say, the Empire of Love, but definitely Economies of Abandonment, I really dig in and start thinking, okay, so what is happening between the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s? Globally, but in a dispersed geography and in a dispersed governmental form. And what I see happening, and again, it's not like it happens. It's like it happens like that. I always wave my hand because it's happening like that, and then it's going back and it's happening like that. Is that the anti-colonial new social movements, the radical new social movements, the anti-colonial movements, the third world movements, right? Post-colonial theory have effectively, definitely by the 60s, I describe it as having ripped the mask off of civilizational liberalism, right? That is that very old, well, in some places still, but that older form, like, oh, we're smashing the social forms and excavating and extracting all your wealth and redistributing, gorging ourselves with it because that's good for you, because we give you civilization, right? And by the 50s, much earlier, but by the 50s and 60s, after that series of false promises, World War after World War, etc., it's like, can I swear on this thing? It's like, fuck you. You're just stealing, and it's not like that was the first time people said it, but it was working. Liberalism could no longer claim that it was ravaging and destroying worlds based on any good, right? So what happens? And that's what I started looking at. That's where late liberalism, so what started happening? Well, liberalism says, in terms of, I get to neoliberalism, in terms of its cultural logics, does this amazing thing. It's just, what a great trick. And it's what I and my colleagues in FLU and were in the middle of in 1984. They say, oh my God, you're right, we're wrong, we were racist. It's like Charles Taylor, all cultures should be assumed to have some worth if they've been going on for long enough. So you tell us how you fit into the worth of the human difference. And then maybe we'll give you back a little bit of what was yours anyways. A little bit, right? So we see a transformation of civilizational liberalism to recognition liberalism. But both are simply ways in which liberalism is able to re-entrench its authority to rule, to judge, and to decide the differences that matter and don't matter. Originally, in Economies of Abandonment, I distinguished late liberalism in its recognition function, in its that broad kind of the broad anthropological function of humans are human in their difference, but not too different, or we will continue to criminalize you, right? So there's always a limit. And I distinguish that from an economic, the transformations of liberal governance relative to the economy. And that's what I call neoliberalism. And in Economies of Abandonment, I said, look, the 50s and 60s are where both of these forms start changing. Right? So you get Keynesian, and then you start in the 50s and 60s, depending where you are in the kind of global movement of this, you get the emergence of the shift in how liberalism justifies the extraction of worth from others, from civilization to recognition. And then you get the economic transformation from a kind of Keynesian to a more conservative Keynesian. It was never really Hayekian. Nobody can govern on an actual just let everyone die. So I started looking at that, and I'm saying that I call this late liberalism, I call this neoliberalism. Right after I published Economies of Abandonment, I say, look, this shift in the economy and in the politics of the governance of difference, they're all what I'm going to call late liberalism. And how they're related to each other, I don't think they determine each other. I don't think they're separate from each other. It's more of maybe an Althusserian kind of loose. There's a kind of looseness to them that doesn't mean they're detached. Is that too long of? But yeah, so now late liberalism it refers to a broad periodization of the transformation of the governance of markets and the governance of difference that begins, I would say, in the late 50s and may have been starting to shake in 2008. Now we really see a shaking, right? Whatever's going on now, the governance of difference and the governance of markets are morphing in ways we don't quite understand yet.
If I may just briefly interject and ask you, like in terms of before we go on to the other some of the other concepts, but like when you're saying, for instance, it's morphing and mutating now, right? How would you probably describe some of the shifts that are happening? Right? I mean, in terms of like, you've talked about like classical liberalism as this civilizational discourse, late liberalism as a strategy of governance, which basically in some sense tries to govern the energies released by anti-colonial movements and so on. In this current conjuncture, when liberalism is in crisis, how would you say it's mutating? Or like if you were to form a toolkit for that?
Yeah, that's one of the things, that, and again, it's how I work. It's like I drive in there and I think, okay, that's as far as I can get. Now I have to sit down and think, how is this morphing? And I've been I've been watching, and I both watch where I sit with my, my oldest relations and colleagues in Australia, and I watch as any social theorist would watch what's going on globally. And I'm not sure. I have nothing better to say than what any halfway intelligent person would say, which is how, put it this way, so Trump's elected, right? And and there was a conference that a performance studies professor or like a think shop, maybe like that he organized down at NYU. And everyone's just trying to figure out, like, what the hell? Because by that time we knew it wasn't just, it was a lot of suburban white people. It was educated people. It was a broader span of middle class and upper middle class white people had voted for him. So you couldn't just say it's this small racist group. It was like, no, it's not that. And my thoughts at the time, and they're still my thoughts, because everyone's really angry, and I'm angry, but my thoughts at the time were that there was this realignment of the far right and the far left that we saw happening around a certain kind of populism, not an old kind of populism, but a certain new kind of populism that is defined as anti-global. In some ways was correct, whether it was the far left or the far right. I mean, in some ways they were absolutely correct, and I am invaded in this, so that those folks who are able to treat their national passporty thing as simply one, I thought of it pneumatic tube. There's one little end of a pneumatic tube, so you go and then you can go and you go and you just shoot through all these pneumatic tubes that crisscross the globe. Sure. And are completely unaffected by your nationalism, as long as you have the money and and other kinds of social indicators. And increasingly then there's this whole other population whose trajectories are going down,
Mm-hmm.
just in terms of class for a moment.
Mm-hmm.
And they're stuck. They're not able to mnemonic tube everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
So the rise of a kind of populism in the left and the right as anti-global was correct. It's like those people who can pneumatic tube were the ones that are increasingly winning class-wise, and everyone else is not.
Okay.
So from a class perspective, and again, I'm a pneumatic tube. So this implicates me, right? And I think, well, you know, that's right. I don't feel American. I'm not nationalist. You know, and a lot of it comes from my grandfather from the Alps, so it has a longer history. But on top of that, melded into that, and I don't think it's just American, but there's James Baldwin would say there's a deep well, certainly James Baldwin, there's a deep American grammar to all this, which is, if the class analysis had been the only thing, okay, but it wasn't just class. It was like, wait a minute, we're white, right? And for a long time, whiteness could absorb a lot, like my family was absorbed into whiteness. And that's what will come to the inheritance. But we absorb. And now whites, we're feeling like they're being chucked out of this. Well, if you have the right skin color, the world just dumps in your lap. So there's a racial, racist component to this. And so what we're seeing is a new kind of it's anti-global, which means a new form of nationalism that is not the old form. It can't be fascist because we didn't have globalization. I mean, it can be fascist, but it's not old-fashioned because there wasn't globalization.
Sure.
And when we return, but now it's like that they're running into forms of the economy that aren't, so we're seeing the same kind of problem with governance of difference and the governance of markets. Neither one are quite working right, or they're working fine, but they're not going to create the kind of thing we've had for you. So those are instead of an answer, those are the kind of things I think we need to be looking at. Right?
Sure.
Those kind of things.
If you have time, we'll come back to this question about fascism, which I find very fascinating in terms of its mutations now. But just to go back to your work, one of the key distinctions that comes up in cunning of recognition, I mean, it took me a long time to figure it out myself in my own work, was the distinction between the ontological subject and the genealogical society, right? And on the one hand, you talk about it as a strategy of discipline, right? It's a strategy of discipline. But what I found very useful in that concept, especially, is this idea of the tense of the other, the fact that the ontological subject is more about the future perfect, whereas when you say the genealogical society is more about the past perfect. And of course, it comes back in many of the legal cases that you discuss in cunning of recognition and elsewhere as well. And along with that, you have developed a vocabulary which I found very useful, like governance of the prior quasi-event, which of course is a key term in terms of the Anthropocene as well. We'll come back to that later on. But I'd like you to talk a little bit about that, right? The distinction between the ontological subject and the genealogical society. It's coming from cunning of recognition, but then of course it's, again, mutating into other works as well.
Yeah. I forgot I had actually started thinking about the ontological subject and genealogical society and cunning, because I really develop it in Empire of Love. But I began kind of like, what the heck is this? And again, it comes from where, I was taught, which is at the heart of like the settler states governance of indigenous people. And what became very clear in these land claim cases, but in just the ordinary way in which indigenous subjects, but I would say Black subjects of color more generally, are apprehended, both visually seen and, apprehended, like grabbed and held, is that people are always looking in and through them to try and see something that was. And in Australia, it's very clear what they're trying to see is what it was like before settlers came. Like, as a settler, I'm looking to try and see what you were before I came. And thus, you, indigenous person, are in the way. So there's a kind of phenomenology, interesting, like that, talking to lay liberal subjects, saying that's what you're doing. Do you understand that's what you're doing to someone? Right? What if you were in the way of what someone wanted to see in you from the moment you're born to the moment you die? That is that constant measuring and failing behavior. Right? So that subject who was, right, in that past perfect sense, became in social theory a mass subject. So it was never you in particular, it's your kind.
Sure.
Your kind people. That's why I say autological subject, because the liberal subject always singularity. The genealogical society is always the mass subject, because you all were the same. You were just one big sameness, whose truth happened, whose truth was right before we arrived into your thing. And then so that's the basic distinction. One is future oriented, right? And one is past perfect. And frozen is rock-like. And it's important because that distinction survives the permutations of liberal form. So in civilizational liberalism, that distinction between the future, liberal, progressive, unfolding, horizontal subject was there. And the genealogical society, the frozen, you're in the way of what I want to see, which is what you were before, blah, blah. But it was governed in a genocidal way. It was like, you have to be destroyed so modernism can go, so the modern world, you're out of time, right? So you just need to either be allowed to die or you have to be wiped out. So time can get back aligned. In recognition, in late liberalism, the distinction still holds, it's just governed differently. Now we want to celebrate that thing that you were, but you're just a bit of a messed up version of. You see, so for me, the genealogical and the autological subject, genealogical society, is super interesting for liberalism in general, because it subtends the permutations of how it governs.
Also,
and so it just flips. So you either kill the genealogical society, celebrate it, but then say to an actual person, you're just a failed version of what we're celebrating. Just saying.
To follow up on what you said, I mean, my reading of your project overall is that it has two dimensions, right? One, of course, is a kind of description and analysis of a mode of power, of the notion of governance, of which of its sort of description of a certain mode of rule, if you may put it that way, right? But there's another way in which you think about it, is how people survive in these interstices, right? So in some ways, I go back to the title of the class that I took with you in 2008, which was Recognition espionage and camouflage. So maybe tell us a little bit more about espionage and camouflage as modes of being, or strategies through which, let's say, people who are abundant, maybe within these pockets of late liberalism, survive. And then I can go on to your refusal of redemption and endurance and stuff like that.
Yeah. No, I think that's really the second aspect of the work that you mentioned is super important, and it's not simply super important to the work, but it's super important to the ongoing nature of really what sits behind all this work, which is, how together do we, as a funny group, refuse to give way. How does Potterbean refuse to give way? Just stubbornly say, no, we're not. We're not. Whatever this, we're not. And so in part, we have to analyze what it is. What's the trick? Like what's the trick? And we're still hunters. So we understand that everything is being baited, and then we look for the hook. Oh, that's a tasty worm, but where's the hook? Oh no, there's no hook here. It's all, there's a hook, right? So it's not simply, it's the work is part and parcel also of this second aspect, which is part of the work, but it's also the purpose of the work, which is life. Okay. So, you're very sweet to bring up that class. It's like, oh yeah, I forgot I
Well, I remember it. It helped me a lot.
No, I do too.
Yeah. It was a good class.
It was a great class. You guys were amazing. So it was a class in which I was trying to take recognition and pull it out a little bit. How to give it more dimensions. That's often what I do. Sometimes concepts get they have too many. The function of a concept is to bring things together so you can see a field that was imminent but not formed or actualized. But then sometimes a concept gets in the way of seeing the field, so you have to pull it apart again and look at it. So I was trying to think of three dynamics in late liberalism. One was a dominant one from a late liberal governance perspective. One was a dominant one, that's recognition. Right? And the trick of recognition of the law, getting you to turn toward it as if it was there for you, when it's actually there for it's I shouldn't say itself because that's abstracting, but the mechanisms are there for the state to re-entrench itself. So recognition is a mode of turning refusal toward itself. Right? And once you turn toward it, that's it. It's got you. Then you're fighting it, as Rex Edmonds said. You're fighting each other with the settler as the adjudicator, and they've won at that point. Espionage was a way of, as the term implies, a way of hiding within this model in order to secret out its strategy. Right. So it's like, oh yeah, I really am here to be recognized, but what you're doing is you're like, it's more and we get to Homi Bhabha, it's more of the either strategic essentialism, like Gayatri talks about, or a form of mimicry, such as Homi Bhabha talks about. But the intentionality is to get the plans, the war plans, right? Camouflage is so all these are forms of survival, like not recognition. Recognition, it's like, at least from Bada bing, it's like, don't go there. Don't actually bite that worm because it is a hook.
Mm-hmm.
Don't swallow, spit it out. If you taste that metal, spit it out.
Mm-hmm.
Espionage is a form of survival, and camouflage is definitely, camouflage is more though, how do you make your way within this long enough to thicken up what you see as the actual otherwise within the system. And so this might, I'll just kind of pull this out a little bit. One of the problems is that with a kind of otherwise, or an imminence, and I'll give a concrete example, but kind of imminence that's there, but not thickened enough to withstand an assault. And I know this sounds like war, but it feels like war. It's just constant assault, and it might not be at the level of actual bomb, but it's straining this conflict. So you have to thicken up and extend enough before someone comes in and tries to co-opt you.
Mm-hmm.
How do you do that? And that's what camouflage is. Camouflage is like, nothing's happening here.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing's happening here. As you're deepening and thickening, and hard to figure out what it is you actually are doing, right? Mm-hmm. So sometimes it's so imminent you don't quite know yet, because these are in a dynamic movement. So say when this all started, and we were trying to figure out what is this Land Rights Act, which is operating under this thing we now call recognition. Well, we don't quite know yet, right? So we have to go spy. Then in spying, we see what it is differently, then we hide. Then we spy, then we see what it is different, then we hide. In each kind of movement, people's own understanding and voicing and counter-voicing is enriched and thickened, right? Until you're good and strong enough, when someone comes, you're like, no, right? So I was trying to get more of the dynamic of the flow and all of this. I don't know if that's what I actually said in the class.
No, I mean,
I think it's close enough.
When we did Battle of Algiers, I think that whole discussion definitely came up there, right?
So yeah. But
that was useful in terms of thinking about agency, of survival, questions like that, right?
But it really is. I mean, I think what's hard for those who have never had to do this is, and it's something that interests Karabing a lot, especially when in the beginning. It's like my ideas that I think, counter imminent ideas in general, they don't come full formed. It's like an irritation in the beginning. It's like, no, something is wrong here, right? But what is it, right? What is it? And if someone comes in and it's like, it's this, it's like, it's hard not to just give way to that. So you need to have some kind of spacing to go to kind of explore what it is, right? And that's what we've tried to been doing together for quite a long time in all our differences. So.
Before I ask you the next question, since we are in the realm of time discipline,
I don't know.
do we have an hour left, or would you like one and a half hours? I was trying to be a little bit E.P. Thompsonish, but okay. I'll move on to something which I found, again, very productive in your work about the refusal of narratives of redemption. Both narratives of redemption, which you you end the introduction of Empire of Love with this, that I refuse redemption. And I just read out one section for people who may not be very familiar with this, right? That you write that the options presented to people who choose or must live at the end of liberalism's tolerance and capitalism's trickle are often not great options. To pretend that they are is to ignore the actual harms that liberal forms of social tolerance and capital forms of life and wealth extraction produce. To wish for a redemptive narrative, to seek it, is to wish that social experiments fulfill rather than upset given conditions, that they emerge in a form that given conditions recognize as good, and that they comply to a hegemony of love rather than truly challenge its hold over social life. So this is what you wrote, of course, in Empire of Love.
It defines my work. That is, I mean, sometimes I mean, I don't reread my work, but that is, I must say, that angry sentence or paragraph that defines it all.
And of course, it's related also to concepts like quasi-event, to concepts like endurance, the fact that you live in a durative time without necessarily any beginning or end, right? I mean, in many ways, a lot of these concepts.
Like hope, great. Hope's another one. Hope, yeah. Like, and how some people are supposed to give other people hope, and it's like, well, what is that about? And so it's a story I tell all the time. But and the hope one, I was at it was a wonderful event, and I was giving sections of Economy or something, and it was really good, lovely people. It was great, but someone asked me, they were like, because I go after hope, go after redemption in Empire, I go after hope in Economies, and the person in the audience said, okay, Beth, you might see hope as a liberal strategy of maintenance, so the way in which it conserves you. But your colleagues, your Economy colleagues, they must have hope because they get on the boat. They keep getting on the boat. And it was part of Economies is about this boat ride across how hard. And I said, I think that's a great question, although I would put it differently. I would say, if not hope, why do they get on the boat? Right? If not redemption, why do people engage in alternative social projects? Right? And if I rephrase the question that way, then I have an answer that is a kind of common affect across Cotabang, including me, for different reasons. And I'm going to say the answer, and then I'm going to, because I'm always going back and forth. And so I'm going to ask, because now I'm really curious. It's a good question. And see what other people say. And I said, the reason we all keep getting on that boat is because we're stubborn. My white grandfather from the Alps, in this little village, he was a knife grinder. He would say to us, he'd say to me, Elizabeth, you tell them you can kill me, but I'm not going anywhere. And we're like, what? But it was this stubborn refusal to give ground and to be obdurate, to be like a rock. Because in fact, liberalism is obdurate in a rock. Why don't liberalism give somebody up? They don't want, it's okay. So it's not like, oh, then let's say being a rock is redemptive. No, it's got its own problem. But and I went back and I didn't say what I said, and I asked one of my daughters, Gigi, and she was so funny. She said, stubborn, ain't it? And I was like, yeah, that's what I said. And then we talked about how it can also be a problem because you get your back up too quick, and then you don't have enough flexibility. But redemption, I very empathy, redemption, and hope. We have to look at the genealogies of these affects. Absolutely. And their deployment in liberalism. Why does liberalism continually desire these affective returns? And from whom? Right.
And yeah. Sorry. Yeah. Well, I mean, this would be a good segue into your intervention into Anthropocene discourse in geontology. I think, I mean, in many ways, the way, again, I would read the difference between, let's say, someone like you and Dipesh Chakraborty. Obviously, for him, it's about reinventing or inventing a new form of politics, even inventing a new form of the human. I mean, that's what he's been calling for, a new planetary politics. There's something which is new. We need to break, so to speak, from what has gone on before. Whereas when I read someone like you, or I read someone like Catherine Newsoff, Billion Black Anthropocenes Now, right? I mean, where I see some of the commonalities between your discourse and Catherine Newsoff's, of course, is to say, for instance, that in many ways, many of these strategies of governance have already existed at these edges, like say settler colonies and so on. It's only becoming more visible on a global scale now. I mean, in fact, Geontopower, the whole framework of Geontopower is precisely that, in some ways, that it's already there, right? It's not a break.
It's been operating in the open for a very long time.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, and when she writes in Billion Black Anthropocenes Now, I mean, she's precisely talking about, let's say, settler colonialism and even like the after effects of the plantation system and so on, right? And you also talk about that from the standpoint of Australia, for instance. So it seems to me, when you're talking, for instance, about this discourse of the Anthropocene, there is a discourse, it says, we need to break with everything that has gone on before. We need to reinvent the wheel altogether again. Whereas scholars like you and yourself are saying that in some ways, it's something which has already lied imminent. And maybe even the question of survival might be something that we can actually look otherwise, not the other of the same, but the other of the other, like the Irigaray phrase. I just want to quote one small sentence from the end of Geontologies before I pass it on to you, where you say, for instance, that, you know, we hear all around us the coming event, the catastrophic imaginary orienting and demanding action, the last wave, the sixth extinction, and yet pulsing through these various terrain is a very different temporality. The river becomes a polluted dump, the fog becomes smog, rock formations become computer components. And I found that very useful in terms of thinking, maybe even about, for instance, how we can think about some of the questions that the Anthropocene poses that have already been there with us, but never been conceptualized quite in that way. So maybe I'd pass it on to you just to think about this question of the Anthropocene and how you handle it as well. Right? Anyway.
Yeah. Just a little question for me to move on through. You know, I talk about, I speak to Dipesh's work a little more in the new book, but I mean, geontology is part of what I'm trying to suggest is that there's a scaling up that mimics a very old liberal civilizational form of governance, and the scaling up says it transforms. Oh, this is now happening to us. When it was never supposed to happen to us, right? It was only supposed to be kind of happening to you without any consequence to us. Is now happening to us, and when that happens, suddenly it becomes about all humans. Right. So in just a kind of simple way, we could say that the Earth has been particular spaces in the thing we call planetary or the Earth have been radically transformed. Species annihilation, human annihilations, geographical just annihilation upon annihilation since the discovery of the New World. Sorry, I can't look at it, flies out of my mouth. Since the invasion of Native American lands on the east side of the Atlantic, right, and the start forcible extraction and enslavement of people in West. Well, you could say, well, that just happened to certain parts of the globe. It's like, no, it didn't.
Mm-hmm.
It didn't happen to certain parts of the globe. It happened to all parts of the globe, and there were radical collapses everywhere. Mm-hmm. It just wasn't your collapse. Mm-hmm. It was your expansion. Mm-hmm. So it wasn't a human problem. Mm-hmm. The Anthropocene, you see, the Anthropocene becomes a human problem when it starts happening to specific kinds of humans. Mm-hmm. So those humans are being taken down too now. Mm-hmm. Okay. I mean, I'm not liking any of this, but we have to radically rethink the modes by which certain forms of human become the human. Mm. And of course, there's also, is it the human? Is it a social relation, a capitalist relation? And for Depeche, he got really enamored with these forms of time and disciplinarity, right? Especially if you look at his Tanner lectures. And again, I love Depeche, but you look at the Tanner lectures and he says, okay, we had a geological time frame. We had a historical time frame. No, we had a geological time frame, a species time frame, and a historical time frame. So 3 time frames. And each one of these time frames for a very long time had been held, you could hold them in very separate spaces. Like geological time didn't touch us, species time was after that, but it didn't touch us. And then there's historical time that touched us. Mm-hmm. And now they're collapsing, and because they're collapsing, we have this new historical consciousness. Mm-hmm. That, and again, I just think, who are we talking about? I just, I think he would say, and I just haven't spoken to him just lately, but I think he would say, well, I'm talking about the Western. I'm talking about Western, which are kind of, that global. So I'm thinking, this is part of it. It's this refusal, and this is the best. This is like regionalized Europe. So the imminent otherwise is that which which refused that abstraction, which always looking and saying, look, you're being gorged by the radical extinction of worlds that are happening to me. Mm-hmm. And this is going to back up, and we've been saying it forever, and now it has. Now you're saying, oh, it's global, and it's like, or what we also see, and I talk about in geontology, you see that social space that is suddenly shocked because it's happening to what they did to others, happening to them, turning to the very people whose worlds they destroyed, both the human and more than human worlds they destroyed, saying, could you give us your secrets? Yeah. For how you've been able to endure. Mm-hmm. I mean, literally, we've been asked that. Carterby's been asked that. We've sat there and people have asked, like Rex or Gavin, like, what in your traditions can help us save the world? Mm-hmm. I said, you're joking me. At some point, I was just not in the mood. And I said, you know what? Mm-hmm. If I was Rex or Gavin and I did have a secret, I wouldn't tell you. But people are much nicer than me. But there is no secret. What's a secret? Even it's out in there. But so those are the general ways in which, and I think Catherine's work is spot on. I think Sylvia Winter's work is spot on like this. It's you cannot begin this question without irreducibly placing it in that history of colonialism and the enslavement of worlds. That is the dispossession and displacement and destruction of worlds that initialize the European subject. You cannot start in a new moment. You cannot start everything is new. No, this is not new. And we will get no answer, no strategy if we act as if we're in a new moment.
I think, generally that's where I would call it like the temporality of post-colonial science fiction, because it's not fiction which is there in the future, but it is fiction that it always starts from the moment where the despoliation has happened. I mean, a lot of people like Octavia Butler or even N.K. Jemisin, are precisely writing from that framework, that temporality.
Yeah, it's already happened.
Yeah, it's already happened, and it's just that the rest of the world is catching up a little too slowly.
And it's also, that's a part of the stubborn thing. Because when I was talking to Gigi, Cecilia Lewis, to get her full name in here, she's really great and smart. And she was just like, we were talking more generally about this because there was a big new neoliberal turn in the mid-2000s, and the state was instituting all these new welfare surveillance restrictions. And she was just like, every time they come up with a new thing, they think we're going to give up, but we've been outwitting them for how many years, but that said, it's really hard because as we're working, say our little group, working to it's working, we redirect all this money that we make out of making these films and artwork into bringing to thicken us up in the way in which camouflage and espionage I was talking about. And it's really actually great. It's working, it's generational, and we're not losing anything. We're actually thickening and extending stuff, and a vision, like their vision about how people should have their own land. But the basis of that is to stay interconnected and interdependent. So all that's good. But it's also the case that the land itself is, it's radically changing underneath us. Okay? But that's part of the stubborn. It's like, okay, well, that happens. If you treat the land wrong, then it goes underground, it changes itself. So you have to just keep going. You adjust, it adjusts, you adjust, So yeah, there you go. But this idea that there's some secret in which, the West can erase what it did and come out clean again. It's like, no. No redemption.
The fears of the animist, the desert, and the virus, right? I mean, I won't talk about that in detail today because of the pressures of the clock, as we say, right? But I'd like to briefly end with two questions. The first one, of course, is could you tell us a little bit more about your work with the Caribbean Collective, both in terms of your digital work as well as the documentaries that you've produced and the movies that you've produced? It was very interesting to read, when you said that there were some continuity errors, but we did it we improvised it on the way. It was very fascinating to read that production aspect. And the second thing, of course, the second question that I'd like to end with is your future work, The Inheritance. The graphic novel that is coming out, and also Life and Worlds, where you talk about this concept of imagination. So we'd like to end probably by talking about these two things.
Okay, the Caribbean Film Collective emerged. There is now Caribbean. Like now you can be born into Caribbean. It's great. It's crazy, right? But Caribbean is an Emmy-angle term, and it functions as a concept. It means an Emmy-angle when the tide is at it's gone out and it's about to start coming back in. And but as concept, we all settled on it. It was suggested, and then everybody was like, "Yeah, that's right." It's because it's what connects everyone's country to each other. Because everyone in Caribbean, except me, I'm from the Alps, share saltwater. They're coastal people. And the Caribbean Film Collective, or the Caribbean in general, emerged, and it's great because it emerged as the otherwise to both the governance of late liberalism, that is, a governance that separates indigenous subjects according to this anthropological imaginary of the clan that is a sovereign, it has a boundary, right? And the neoliberal state that said, you know, we're done with recognition, we're just in the market. If you want money, open your land for mining. So Cottabing emerged when a group of people were at a really precarious position because they had been dispossessed of legitimacy in their own community by this Land Claim Act. They were like, oh, you guys aren't the real traditional owners here, even though they born there, their ceremonies there, everything. It was like, no, you're not real, because again, you're not past perfect. Things have changed, therefore you're not real, therefore you don't belong here. And then this neoliberalism that was like, and if you want any money, you just have to open your land to money. So Cottabing emerged to say, we know where each of our lands are, each of our family lands are, but we refuse to be governed as if they were these sovereign areas, because we understand they're interdependent. And the film stuff came because, well, it's a long story, but the short of it is, in this very terrible moment in the late 2000s, everybody wanted to push a certain kind of what they saw as the real into public discourse about indigeneity. And we all decided to do it. It was like, okay, let's just do it. And, you know, no one knew how to do film. So we made two with, we'd bring some people over who helped us with craft a little bit. And then the last two, how many do we have? It's like 7 now. The last 5 we just do it on our own production costs with iPhones and stuff. And they're great because the content of them is, someone comes up with an idea, and then they're like, the group is like 30 to 50 depending on the day, and other people just decide whether they want to, what role they want to play in it, or they want to just be doing the iPhones or holding the sound or whatever. And we usually have a day or two in which we do big kind of shooting around it, and then we just shoot everything else whenever something happens we think it'll fit in to the basic story. And they're kind of nuts, but they're really great because there's no script, there's a story. Like, we grew up together, so we know the drill. So if someone like with our second film, some of the young guys, they said, we want this film to be about how we find deer in the bush and are chased by police. And then a couple of the older, like a little younger than me, but kind of the older, they're like, we can't just have it be about like young guys getting drunk. So we should put in that you guys are drinking by a dreaming sacred site where there's illegal mining. So the police are called because the miners don't want you guys to, and so then that happens, and so then the whole thing kind of goes on, and the whole thing ends up being who goes to jail for what kind of stealing, right? And because we all know each other and we know how this works, that they're kind of minimal plot. We don't need a script. Everyone just comes up with their own lines and how they're going to act it out, and we just go forward. You know, and it's fun, and every film has to weave, it's our principle, you have to weave some aspect of an older story into it. It could be at several layers, historical, dreaming, all of them kind of like going like this. And so that what they're doing is functioning as a kind of school, as a memory extender, as a like, yeah, I know what this is now, I acted it out. And the country can feel you remembering and acting out, so it strengthens the country in relation to you. it also is a big financial and capital redirection because since we now do them on iPhones, and by this time we've all kind of learned how to do this, I've definitely learned how to edit. We skim off the money that accumulates around this kind of body, right? And we use that to make the films. So, you know, how much it costs. And then the money we make from the films, we redirect into land-based stuff. So we buy boats and cars and trucks and all kinds of stuff and get kids and us back and forth. So it's also anti-capitalist machine. And it means they can travel. So they've been in Moma, they've been in Tate, they've been to Manila, they've been to China. That we go everywhere, and as they go everywhere, again, espionage, camouflage, recognition, there's a deepening of everyone's understanding, and then everyone's opinion, and then conversation about what is happening gets thickened up amongst us. And then that leads to more. So it's this great machinery that in part is about filmmaking, but really is about this much broader social analytic project that stretched all the way back to.
Have you screened those movies somewhere? I mean, I see that on your Facebook page from time to time, but have you screened the movies elsewhere, like outside Australia or in the US and elsewhere?
Yeah. To say what?
I was like, have you screened those movies elsewhere?
Oh yeah, they're everywhere.
Yeah, I see.
No, I mean they're not everywhere. We actually keep them behind a wall. So if you want to see them, you have to ask permission. But yeah, no. We've been very lucky. We're in galleries. We're in film. Right now, we're in the Melbourne Film Festival again with the most recent one, which is. We were doing an interview last night for the ABC in Australia, and they asked what genre it was. We say our genre is Cotter being genre, but it's kind of like a hip hop ballad, and it just follows different characters as they go around the kind of ordinary thing, in which nothing quite works because there's this level of governmental corruption and ordinary. It's kind of look at the economies of abandonment.
Sure.
The inheritance is in some ways a very simple little story, and it's about where, when, what we think inheritance is. The punchline is that inheritance is not something that's in the past. And instead inheritance is the infrastructures by which bodies are separated, differentiated, some elevated and some disenfranchised. But that kind of simple point is told. It's told as a story, and it's based on the little Elizabeth, who's like between like 2 and 7, who is growing up in Shreveport, Louisiana, from 1964. It's kind of till I'm like 9-ish, let's say. So 64 to whatever that would be, 73, 74. Who in her house is a framed, kind of size of this.
I see.
A framed, it's about that size. A framed image of kind of these blurred lines that all her relatives stand in front of and argue about. And in every one of her relatives' house, and all her relatives are up north in Buffalo, everyone has the same image. Everyone sits in front and argues about it. And the images of the area in Trentino, in which are my patrilineal villages, Corzole. And the argument is that Corzole is Corzolo. It's Austrian-Hungarian Empire. Is it Italy? And so the story is about the the damage that was passed down, if you want, the kind of psychic damage that was passed down, and the violence that was passed down as my Povinelli clan. So they have clans up there. I'm the Seamanauts Povinelli. So as our clan leaves this frontier area during the First World War, when it's a slaughterhouse, goes to Buffalo, they're knife grinders, and then we end up in Shreveport. My father's was raised. So it starts as like this unclosable space. Like you think, oh, we're so lucky, we know where we come from. It's not even general, it's like specific. But the closer you get, the more it breaks apart, because no one can agree on what it is, what it means, or what it did. But then the book turns and says, but let's get real. Let's talk about who mattered and who didn't matter in the place I actually grew up. Not this thing that passed, but in Shreveport in 1964 and 65, when the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act were being passed, but the schools were being resegregated. There was still like rampant, there still is. And there it was like, we had George Wallace, who was winning. He won like 5 states when I grew up. We had, it was just, I was in the Bible Belt where, so it's an analysis of how we think about inheritance as an infrastructure of the present. And it's a kind of prequel to everything that happens in Australia. So that if you know my work in Australia, then you can kind of see why when I went there was like, it's like not to use this terrible word, but we really deeply, it's like, oh, you guys, like me, I was like, oh, we have clans too. And they're like, no, you're white, you can't have clans. I was like, no, really, I'm a Seamanauts Povinelli, and there's another kind of Povinelli, and we only married, because we married like, not anymore, but like in Roses and Marinellas and the whole. And up there, it's, people don't consider themselves, like they're a frontier. So it's like, there was the Austrian and Hungarian Empire, before that the Roman Empire, and then the Italian nation. But there's this way in which you're colonized, but you don't lose your identity to country. We're still Corzo. Sure. And that was so much like what they were. They were like, yeah, we're from Malbala, or we're from Bonagai or Bonacula. Now the Australians say, but there's still Bonagaya, Bonacula, we're still Emmy, right? This imposition of a nation state can't obliterate. And yet, with all this, and I grew up in the woods, we grew up hunting, I come from my household very violent, I'm very comfortable with all these things. So there was a lot of resonance. So what made my life so different? White supremacy made my life different, right? And so it become, that was also for me what started all these books, what started all this thought was really, and it's not like I should have seen this, but really confronting this in a deep way when I got to Australia, which means how brain dead really I was. Even though I see it, I'm in it, but the inheritance, like you can be so wrapped up in your own family tragedy, right? And it's like, that's my inheritance, my family. It's like, oh, bullshit. I mean, it's a very sad story, very compelling. I still cry at times in it. There's a sound piece we're doing it. But that kind of self-absorbedness, right, has to be ripped away. It's just like, fuck that, Absent of all this kind of crazy stuff about the Alps and our heritage, like strip it all away. And you know what it was? A white girl being elevated by white supremacy. And it didn't matter that I have a clan, that I have a village, that, I was on a frontier. I come from a frontier too. My family was slaughtered by various empires too, blah, 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 blah. Nevertheless, the infrastructures of whiteness in America meant, woo, I go up as other people are being held down. And that's what the book's about. But it's told in a story. It's just a really nice story.
Well, I'm looking forward to reading that, and you've given me a cue to reading it as well before I turn it over to Rishabh.
Okay.
That it's like a prequel, so I think I'll read it more like the Star Wars stuff, right? Like I started with the last movie, and then I'll work around to the first one. Right? So thank you very much, Ben. This was lovely talking to you.
And thank you so much for doing this. You were so generous and like brilliant. Like you read stuff, I was like, wow, I never even saw that in me. So
well, hopefully we won't wait 12 years to talk to each other face to face again.
It was 12 years. 12 years ago.
Yeah, it was 12 years. 2008. Yes. I've been, So.
And Rishabh, thank you for organizing this.
Yes. Thank you to Rishabh.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot, like both of you, for this great conversation on behalf of Borderlines. And it's really, I guess, like it's going to give like people a lot of food for thought